In hand or machine applique, stems are of the most consistent elements. Even and well-placed stems and vines build a strong foundation for the rest of your design. It is therefore important to give a little attention to the skills involved to make good ones. If the stems you need are straight, you can cut on the straight lines of the fabric. But if you have bends, scrolls or waves, it's better to cut your fabric on the bias. The most effective way to cut a piece of fabric to get the most bias strips or the longest strips out of a piece, you can take a square like this. It doesn't have to be a square. Just fold it over that you get your bias on this seam and over again. If you fold it back like that and make sure that all your pieces get together, this will make a good cutting edge. Trim off the edge to get a nice crispy side on that side. This will make it easier to cut your strips. The strip is 1 inch, and as you can see, it is quite a good length. Cutting 1/4 inch bias strips is a very delicate task. As you can imagine, they will stretch quite easily. I use spray starch. And then I just wave it around a little bit to give it some air drying. A bias maker is a very useful tool. This is a 6mm or 1/4 inch bias maker. You always cut your strips double the size of your final stem. So for this one, I'm using a 1/2 inch strip. It was cut on the bias, and I've lightly starched and air dried the strips. The first thing to do is to guide your 6mm bias tape through the bias maker. There's a special slot at the bottom of this, and make sure that you've got the sticky side facing up to towards the fabric. I'm going to use a pin to guide the front end through. There we go. From the top, we will then insert this strip and also guide it through with your pin and fold it out slightly. We have to cut off this edge, otherwise that glue is going to stick to your iron. Gently pull on the bias maker as you iron. Don't go too fast, as this can cause bubbles. This is also done with a dry iron. Try as far as possible to make your bias in one steady motion. Once the bias is made, you can tear the strip from the back. It's easier to cut it in inside and take it off. You will see that the bias is now covered with a gluey strip. It is like applique paper on the bottom side. If you mark your fabric where you want to place your stem, decide beforehand if you are going to place your stem on the top or the bottom. It doesn't really matter, but we try to sew the concave side before we sew the convex side before we sew the bottom. Because the placement of stems on a border of a quilt can influence the whole layout, it is important to mark it clearly on your quilt before you sew it down. You can make a paper template or use a ruler like this one of Sue Pelland. In any applique, the stems are placed before any other elements. This eliminates the need to finish off the end and prevent the extra bulk that it will cause. After making and placing the strip, you can sew it down with a fancy embroidery stitch. This one was sewn with stitch number 49 on my Bernina Aurora. You can also sew it down using a blind hem stitch, an invisible thread. Strips were woven to form the trunk in this whimsical tree quilt by Erla Sillier. Look how effectively the width of the strip is decreased towards the end of the branch. The buttons are placed strategically at the end of every branch to cover up the end of the strip. It is therefore important to get your order of elements correct. Stems will always be the foundation.